So we said that there are some problems with that traditional model, right? Because that traditional model doesn't consider the fact that people move around, right? People move around the world, and also it doesn't consider the fact that there are many, let's say, Korean people, there are many Indian people, Singaporean people, or Chinese people living in ENL countries, right? So the boundaries are not as clear, right? Which country is ENL, which country is ESL? The boundaries are not clear, right? So there are some problems. And also the fact that if you say, oh, this is English as a native language country, it gives it a sense of superiority, right? That it's better than other varieties, which might not be true, right? Which is not true, right? So we identify some problems, and then we look at Kachu's model, right? The classification of word Englishes into 3 circles, right? The inner circle, the outer circle, the expanding circle, depending on the functions, rather than whether English is your native language or not, right? And we look at Modiano's model, where you have EIL, right? English as an international language that shares feature with other varieties, like this one, right? So EIL, English as an international language that shares most of the features with American English or other varieties like CAN, Canadian English, Australian English, and so on. Okay? And this is a graph that tells you the estimated interactions that occur in English, right? This is after Gradle 2006. So you see that this area, the blue area, takes maybe the majority of the space here. It accounts for 74%, right? Interactions in English are between non-native speakers, right? Interactions are between non-native speakers. And between native speakers, only 4%, right? Only 4%. Now, this means that most English interactions take place not for communication with native speakers anymore. So why do we, or why should we rely on ENL, English as a native speaker model anymore, right? So that's the question. Now, so today we'll start from here, okay? Today we'll start from here. So defining English, right? So after we consider many models of English and problems that come with each label, like English as a native language, English as a second language. Now, is English, in your opinion, like a planet? So this is a planet, right? On your left-hand side, this is a picture of photo of a planet. And this is a picture of a galaxy, right? You know, galaxy is like a group of gas or planets or other rocks, right? That are held together by gravitational force, right? So it is a combination of so many things, right? This is a galaxy. Whereas a planet is just a planet, right? Now, English, based on our discussion, previous discussion, is it like this or is it like on your right-hand side, a galaxy, right? So we are trying to, in this section, in this unit, we are trying to put forward the view that English is like a galaxy rather than a planet, right? So we have 2 terms for that kind of description. If people think, and many people think that English is like a planet, like this, right? We say that they have a monolithic view of English. Mono is one, right? Monolithic, mono is one. And then if people think that English consists of many varieties and many speakers and many different groups of speakers, right? Many different contexts, they think of English as a galaxy, like your right-hand side picture. We call that they have, we say that they have a pluralistic view of English, right? Pluri is many, right? So there are a lot of differences between the 2 sides, right? From monolithic, they think that each language is a single object, right? So there's one pure English out there, right? There's one pure English out there, and other things just deviate. Other varieties of English just deviate from that single single form of English, right? But for people who have a pluralistic view, they think that each language is made up of multiple coalescing objects, meaning a language like English consists of different kinds of practices and contexts in which people use the same language differently, right? So when you talk to your parents, you speak one way. When you talk to your friends, you speak one way. When you present your paper in the classroom, or when you do a presentation in a classroom, you use it in a different way. When you communicate with a Chinese businessman, let's say that there's such an occasion, you use English in a different way. So according to this group of people, they think that English consists of individual practices and individual contexts in which each context is different from the others, like that. And all of them make up a whole language called English, like that. So you understand the two sides, right? And then the second one, each language has clear boundaries, right? That, okay, this is English and this is not English, this is non-native, this is native, like that. Whereas for the people who have a pluralistic view, they think that each language has fuzzy boundaries. People move around, right? And language moves around with them. And also, the fact that you might change your grammar, you might change your vocabulary, you might change your accent, depending on the context. That means that English doesn't have a rigid or clearly defined shape. So English has fuzzy boundaries for those people, right? This is the same as English has an unambiguous shape and form versus English has an ambiguous shape and form, right? Because depending on your, depending on the person you interact with, depending on the context, you'll use English differently in many ways, vocabulary-wise, accent-wise, or grammar-wise, right? And finally, English language is uniform and stable. English language is variable, hybrid, and dynamic. Right? So English, as you know, English changes every day, right? And we have looked at how English has changed within the period of 2,000 years also, right? So English is never stable, right? But people who have a monolithic view, they think that English should be kept stable, and we should not allow English to change like that. So this is just a review to show you. So this is the purpose of this slide. The purpose of this slide is to show you that there's no such monolithic view of English, right? So English should be viewed as a plural from, English should be viewed from a pluralistic view, right? Because people think that, people who have the monolithic view, they think that English originates from a pure language, just like Old English or like Latin, right? And then it has degenerated, meaning it has decayed. It has gone bad since Old English time, like that. So people still have that kind of thinking, right? Remember in the 18th century, when we have dictionaries, when we have grammar books, people want to purify language, right? People want to purify the English language. So it's the same group of people who have that monolithic view of language, right? But as you know, standard English is just a recent notion, right? Only after, let's see, the early modern period, right? That when William Caxton brought the printing press to England, so we set the spelling right there, right? We set the spelling, and then we set the grammar, and we set vocabulary in the 18th century, right? So it's a recent notion. Before that, there's no such thing as standard English, right? Standard English, the English that we use and the English that we teach to non-native speakers, like that. So one version, the Midlands dialect, was selected as the standard, right, after the printing press, because the printing press was brought to London, and London is in the Midlands area, right? And elaborated, you guys know that one version, the Midlands dialect, was elaborated, meaning that it got expanded to cover many areas. In the Renaissance, we go back to Greek and Latin sources, right? And we found that English is poor in terms of the vocabulary that we have. So we have to borrow a lot of terms, and we have to come up with a lot of terms to describe things, right? Scientific discoveries and so on, right? So we try to elaborate and expand the use of English. And we codified the use of English, right? In the 18th century, you guys know codification, writing, right? Writing down the rules, writing down how we should use English. That's when grammar books, that's when dictionaries came about, right? Codification. And finally, standard English was accepted by a large group of people, right? And even nowadays. So the last paragraph here is what we call standardization. That's what it means by standardization, right? So I should write this out. So standardization, where's standardization, right? Selection, elaboration, codification, and acceptance. So if I ask you what or when was English standardized, or explain the standardization process of English, now these are key terms, right? The key terms that you might want to think about. Selection, elaboration, codification, and acceptance, right? Not that these have to be in order, right? But typically in this order. But sometimes two steps or two processes might happen at the same time, or concurrently happen at the same time, which is possible. Right? So standardization, you guys know standardize, right? To make it standard. Standard has the meaning of same, right? Sameness or similarity. Meaning people should read alike, people should people should pronounce words alike, people should write alike, and people should use language alike, right? So that's what it means, standardization. Just like when you standardize the shirt sizes, right? S, a small, should be a small for everyone, right? If you buy from the same brand and from the same model, right? From the same style, S should be the same, right? Whether you buy it in Busan or whether you buy it in the US, if it's by Uniqlo, for example, and the style is the same, it should be standardized, right? So that people of that size could keep buying, and people who are within that size could buy the same size, right? So that's what it means, standardization. Standardize is to make it the same, to make things the same way, right? In terms of language, to make people speak the same way, pronounce things the same way, or write the same way, right? So standardization consists of these steps. Selection, because you have to select, right? Which variety, which form should be written, right? Should be written down. So in terms of English, it's the Midlands area, right? The Midlands dialect, right? Because that's where the printing press was first situated, first located in, and so on, right? And that's the dialect of William Caxton and his people, right? And elaboration, because English is not sufficient to talk about everything, right? Philosophy, biology, scientific discoveries during the Renaissance period, we have to borrow a lot of words, and we have to translate words and so on. So that's elaboration, so that English can compare with other languages. And then codification, now you have to write down, fix it, right? You have to fix the language. Fix meaning keep it stable. You have to fix the language by writing down dictionaries, by writing down grammar books, right? So that people can follow. That's codification. And then finally, once all these steps have taken place, then people start to accept it, like, oh, this is right, this is the right form, this is the correct form, right? So that's where people kind of are misguided to think that, oh, standard English is the best form, the correct form, and other varieties are not correct, right? Because people accept it as a rule or something, right? Okay. So that's why that standardization is the origin of the monolithic concept of English, right, or of other languages, which in fact there was no such thing before the advent of the printing press, right, before the coming of the printing press, right. So this is a diagram that shows you on your left-hand side, this is the monolithic view of English, right? So when you have dialects, these dialects are not good language, right? So dialects are below good language, and errors like non-native speakers, they're not even that good language of English. So there's just only one form, one pure form of language up here, right? And when you go down the diagram here from the top here, when you go down, these forms like dialects and non-native speakers errors, they are bad language like that. However, the linguistic view, the pluralistic view is like this. You go up, right? You go up, you go bottom up, and then there's idiolect. You know idiolect? The way individuals speak a language, right? So Goan might speak differently from Junsong here, right? So ideo is individual, right? So each person speaks differently, right? In terms of accent, in terms of word choice, in terms of grammar, right? But they share a lot of features. That's why they can communicate. That's why they can understand each other. However, at the smallest level, each individual, each person speaks differently, right? And then these people make up one particular dialect. So Busan people, even though each Busan person might speak differently from another Busan person, they all share the Busan, a lot of Busan features. So this is dialect, like Busan dialect, like that. And then many dialects would make up one language, right? So this is what we call the pluralistic view, right? So it's not from top down, but a language consists of many varieties, and at the bottom is individual varieties, like that. And this is a different issue, but related issue. Teaching English in the classroom, what should you teach in the classroom? Now that we know that we should have a pluralistic view, right, rather than a monolithic view. So questions come as to what kind of English should we teach in a classroom, or should you study? Now, there are some advantages of teaching or learning standard English. So these are self-explanatory, so I can go through this quickly. There's a lot of existing infrastructure, resources, and training available for SE, standard English, and it's codified to a great extent. So it's useful, or it's convenient. In other words, it's convenient to teach SE, standard English, because if you go to Kyobo bookstore, if you go online, standard English is codified to a great extent, right? You have grammar books, you have dictionaries, all of those things codify standard English. So it's convenient to find resources, right? So the first one is convenience. Second one, standard English is familiar through broadcasting, public documents, the media. Until these days, right? Up until today, standard English is very dominating, right? Dominating in many areas of the world, in many domains. So you can find examples, you can find samples easily. So it's convenience also. Now, SE, standard English, is what most tests. What most tests. Standard English is what most tests. In other words, if you study, if you want to take a topic, what do you call? TOEIC, TOEFL, topic is what I should take. Test of Korean proficiency or something. TOEIC, TOEFL, IELTS, IELTS, whatever, right? So standard English is what most tests test. So if your students, or if you have to take those tests, then of course, you have to study standard English, right? And standard English is expected for study and work in some context. So in class, like our class or other English classes, standard English is what people require you to do. So that's why you have to study, right? And standard English is strongly associated with prestige and socioeconomic of the public mind. So people think that if you speak standard English, then you are educated, right? And you are smarter than other people, and so on, right? So these might be some advantages that you might want to keep in mind, right? However, there are also disadvantages that you should be aware of. One is standard English is not attainable, right? It's unattainable for most learners, right? So if we have 100 people here in our class, or in other English classes that we take here, do you think how many % of those people can become native speakers after graduation from Hanyang? How many % can become native speakers? So this is true, right? It's actually unattainable for most learners, right? Maybe 99% or even 99.99% cannot become native speakers even after graduation, or even after their doctoral study even, right? So what you test them in our class or in other classes, not in our class, what you test them is how they failed to become native speakers, right? If you teach only standard English, right? So if they get 90 out of 100, it means that they are short of becoming a native speaker by 10%, like that, right? So that's what most tests test, right? And standard English, second one, standard English is inadequate and or inappropriate for many local contexts and needs, right? So if you use standard English in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and so on, not that you cannot communicate, it's not that, but it might be inadequate because they will have local words, they will have local accents, which you may not be familiar with. If you go to India, you might not be able to communicate with Indian people who speak English with Indian accents, for example, right? So it's inadequate, right? And standard English can be very alienating, right? Very awkward, very not familiar for non-native speakers who themselves have non-standard accents and use local features, right? So think of this like if you have a professor, an American professor, right, who has to teach a British accent. So it would be unfamiliar to that American. It would be unfair, right, for that American teacher who has to teach how to pronounce English words in a British way, like that, right? So this is what it means. And then most native speaker teachers don't use standard English themselves either, because some of them come from Texas, some of them New York, right? So many have local accents and local dialects. So this is what part of the pluralistic view, right? That when you have individual ways of speaking that makes up one local accent and so on, right? So you cannot expect that most native speaker teachers will speak standard English or with standard English accent, right? And another thing that you should keep in mind is the notion of proficiency, right? Proficiency, when you think about proficiency, most of you in this class would think that, oh, if I'm proficient in English, if I'm fluent in English, if I'm proficient in English, right, it means I'm close to being a native speaker, like that, right? That's what you think of proficiency, right? Most people. But Widdowson, who is a great applied linguist, he says that you are proficient in a language to the extent you possess it, make it your own, bend it to your will, assert yourself through it, rather than simply submit to the dictates of its form. So in other words, what he's saying here is that you are proficient in a language only when you can say it the way you want and communicate what you want to communicate to people, to other people. Right? You might ask me this question, are non-native Englishes, non-native meaning, for example, Indian English, Korean English, Singapore English, and so on, right? Are non-native Englishes inadequately learned versions of correct native Englishes or not, right? So there might be that question. So this is a debate between two sides, right? So the people who support that the thinking that non-native Englishes are wrong native Englishes, in other words, right? Are mistakes that people make because they fail or they do not succeed in studying native English, right? People who support that would argue that native and non-native speakers have different intuitions about a language, right? For example, they differ in their judgment of what is grammatically correct and what is not, which means non-native speakers have different internalizations of the language. So they process the language differently from native speakers, in other words, right? So that's one argument that they have. And this is true. I'm teaching another class, grammar class, and then when I asked students about their judgment of whether a sentence is correct or not, we have disagreement as to what sounds right and what sounds not right, like that. So this partly is true. This is partly true, right? However, American people also sometimes can have different judgments as to what's correct and what's not correct also, right? So this is not confined to native and non-native only, right? But this also goes to native and native also, right? So this is, while it's partly true, is not wholly true, right? And especially in the expanding circle, there are no institutionalized varieties of English, meaning that English in the expanding circle, you guys remember expanding circle like Korea, like the countries that have not been colonized by England, China, Thailand, Korea, France, and so on. There are no institutionalized varieties of English, meaning in those areas, in the expanding circle areas, English is not a recognized variety, unlike Indian English, unlike Singaporean English, unlike Hong Kong English, in other words, right? So Korean English, right, is an attempt to justify inability to acquire native language. So these people think. In other words, these people think that, oh, what you call Korean English is just your unsuccessful attempt of learning native English. It's your excuse to call it Korean English because this is a new variety that you guys speak. That's an excuse. That's what this group of people think. Okay. However, there's also the other side to it, against, right? They don't think of non-native Englishes as different, right? As deficit. Deficit meaning lacking in some aspect, right? Lacking, not successful, like that. But these people who are against that kind of thinking, they think that non-native Englishes are different, not deficit. They are just different. Just like white people are different from black people, like that. Not that there's something wrong with black people, like that, okay? So, of course, non-native speakers may have different intuitions about grammatical judgment. However, speakers of the inner circle varieties also have different intuitions as well. So what? That's what I already talked about, right? American people also sometimes, not all the time, sometimes think of one grammatical issue differently from British people and from Australian people. So what? If non-native speakers think of grammaticality differently, so what, right? And the so-called non-institutionalized varieties stem from the wrong notion that non-native Englishes are interlanguages striving to achieve native-like character. You guys know interlanguages? You guys know that? So interlanguages are different stages of your language acquisition. Language acquisition is studying language, right? To acquire language. So your interlanguages could be on many steps, on many levels, right? If you study English for a year, for example, your interlanguage perhaps is very in the beginning stage, right? But if you, let's say you are an expert in syntax, right, for example, you might come close to being a native speaker, like that. So inter is between, right? Between two forms, between your native language and the target language, like that. However, people think that non-native Englishes stem from the speaker's local linguistic and socio-cultural backgrounds, and thus are varieties in their own right. In other words, this is like American English. So American English, has many varieties, right? Texas English, New York English, New England English, and so on, even based on social class that we study, based on ethnicity that we study. So those people's dialects stem from their local linguistic and socio-cultural backgrounds, including the social class they are from, including the ethnicity that they belong to. So just like Korean English, right? So Korean English comes into being because you are exposed to your local and socio-cultural background. So we should think of Korean English in that light, like that. So there are two sides to the debate, right? So which one you want to side with? So you should think about that, because I might ask you on the exam, right? What is important, I think, what is important in teaching English or learning English is your focus on intelligibility, right? Focus on intelligibility. So being intelligible is when you are understood by the person you are talking to, right? But there are three components to intelligibility, right? One is the ability of your listener, your hearer, to recognize individual words or utterances, right? So this is the most basic level, right? The most basic level. If you take a phonetics class, I think that's the level that it wants to achieve, right? That class wants to achieve. That if you can pronounce individual words or utterances or even a long sentence, right? If the listener can recognize what you say word by word or even the whole sentence, then you are successful at that level. But that's only the lowest level, though. There's this comprehensibility level also. The listener's ability to understand the meaning of word or utterance in a given context, right? So what you say may not make sense at all, even though the listener recognizes individual words, right? And finally, interpretability, the ability of the listener to understand the speaker's intentions behind the word or utterance. This is the highest level, right? Because what appears on the surface might not be what he means, right? When you say fine like that, it might not be fine, right? And so there are things that don't affect intelligibility. For example, non-use of the third person present tense. She looks sad. This doesn't affect intelligibility at all, right? Because you know who it is she, right? And you know the verb, right? And this happens in Old English, Middle English, and early modern English, right? Many of the verb endings fell off, right? The understanding is okay still, right? Even though the word order might become more rigid, right? Omission of the definite and indefinite articles, a and the, right? That doesn't really affect intelligibility. Use of all-purpose tag. This is like a frequent thing that I have heard recently. You don't like chocolate, instead of do you, right? You have to use do you instead of English. You don't like chocolate, isn't it? Meaning, is that right? In other words, you don't like chocolate, is that right? People say that a lot, especially Indian people, real Indian people. Because this semester, I'm studying Korean as a second language, Soksa, at the graduate school here. So I have class on Tuesday and Thursday. And I'm studying history, Korean history. So we went back to like the Neo-Paleolithic period, whatever, right? Paekje and so on. So, and we study like all the uprisings, Tonghak uprising, peasant uprising, and so on, right? Chondowan, Lee Seung-man, whatever, right? So in that class, my professor is an Indian guy who is also a graduate of Hanyang. He graduated with a degree in history or something. So, but he's Indian, he's not Korean. He uses this kind of all-purpose tag a lot. You don't like chocolate, isn't it? Like that. So this is something that I have heard frequently, and it is and attested is a frequently found feature. And plural of non-count nouns, this doesn't affect intelligibility at all. Informations with the S, many kinds of information. Staffs with an S, typically in US English you don't put the S on staff, right? Or advices, many advices. But in the expanding circle or in the outer circle, people also put an S after nouns that are traditionally uncountable, like that. And TH sound, voice or voiceless, thin, tin, there, and so on. This doesn't affect intelligibility. Of course, thin means different thing from tin. Of course, I know that, and we know that. But in a particular context, there cannot be any confusion, right? Because thin is an adjective, tin here is a noun, for example, right? And you know what the speaker is trying to say in a particular context. So there's no confusion because we don't speak in minimal pairs, right? Now, the last thing that I will talk about is Korean English because this is appropriate to the context that we are talking about. Korean English, since 1997, English has been taught from the 3rd grade of elementary school. And there are some other socio-cultural factors that give rise to Korean English, like the establishment of English-only villages in Korea, and English is more than just another foreign language. So English has a lot of impact or a lot of influence on in Korea, right? So there are two views on Korean English. One is that it has not been codified. So this guy argues that, meaning, remember codification, it has not been written down, so it's not an institutionalized version. So unlike Singaporean English, unlike Hong Kong English, unlike South African English, unlike Indian English, Korean English, there's no such thing as Korean English, in other words, because it has not been codified, right? But there's also another view that says it has been codified to a great extent, serving as the endo-normative standard. Endo is inside, right? So serving as the inside standard for Korean education, for English education in Korea. So in other words, people who wrote textbook, right? English textbook to be used in secondary schools or high schools among Korean students, like that. So evidence in textbook with features that native speakers find unacceptable. So this group of people, like Peck 1995, this group of people thinks that, well, there's such a thing as Korean English because it has been codified, even though it's used internally, endo-normative standard, internally circulated among Korean people only. So I will give you the handout for this. So we'll see features of Korean English that you might find interesting because you use them the same way, in other words. So these are research studies by Shim, Rosa, Jin-young. Okay, in 1994 and 1999. I'm sorry that I couldn't find newer studies, right? But at least these studies are true around the turn of the century, right? So this is one of the people that thinks that there's such a thing as Korean English, right? So she argues that there's codification of Korean English, right? As you can see, because the textbook, English textbooks that have been used in secondary schools in Korea have remained more or less the same even after World War II. And even though you have a lot of educational professionals who went to the US, who went to the UK, and came back to change the educational policy or to change the English-related curriculum, secondary level English textbook were left essentially untouched. In other words, English textbook remained the same for many, many years, at least until the turn of the century that she did her research. So her data came from High School English 1 in use from 1987, 1995. Of course, there's a Korean name for it, but I didn't cite that here. These are features that she identified as Korean English, okay? And these are just only the features that I selected from her work. So actually, there are many more, okay? So we'll just go over some. Day by day in Korean English, it means every day. We go to school day by day. In other words, we go to school every day. Or Koreans eat rice day by day. Koreans eat rice every day, in other words. But in US English, it doesn't mean that though. In the US English, you say it like, my father grew stronger day by day, right? Oh, well, it has the sense of every day, but you have to have like the increasing sense, right? Gradually increasing or something like that. It just doesn't mean every day in a pure sense, right? Yeah, it means on a daily basis, but you need some appropriate context to use it in, right? Grew stronger, like day after day, like that. So a little bit more and more, like that, right? It has the sense of every day, but you have to use it in an appropriate context, like when something is increasing. Like in this case, the strength is increasing, right? Each day, like that. And after all, in that textbook, High School English 1, in that textbook, it means finally, at last, or eventually. Like she studied very hard. After all, she passed the exam. Like eventually, she passed the exam. So that's what that textbook has, right? Now, in US English, how should I explain this? It's different. Like the rain has stopped, so the game will go ahead after all. Yes, it has a sense of eventually or at last, but the context is, it means despite all of those things, okay? So like despite all of those things, in the end, like that. So yes, it has the sense of eventually or at last or finally, but it has a contrastive sense also. Like despite the rain, in other words, the rain has stopped, right? Despite the rain, in the end, the game will go ahead, like that. So you have some kind of contrast. You must have some kind of contrast to use the word after all, right? Not just finally, not just eventually, but some kind of contrast. Do with, next one is do with. In that textbook, it has a sense of endure or put up with, right? Do you think I can do with an insolent, a lazy man like him or not, right? However, in US English, you use do with, how should I explain this? This place could do with a good cleaning, meaning you need good cleaning, right? Could do with meaning need. This place needs a good cleaning, like that. Next one is interesting, on life. Means alive, because in that textbook there's this example, gardens come on life again, meaning gardens become alive again, like that. On life actually exists, right? Actually exists, but existed in Old English, right? Old English before, before grammaticalization, right? On life, preposition plus a noun, we study grammaticalization, and then on became right, as a suffix, remember? So that's a path of grammaticalization. It existed in Old English though. So it means Korean English is very old, Old English, right? Just like American English. American English is very Old English actually. When people move from the British Isles to America, right? They brought with them their accents and stuff. Now, American English has been that way for a long time, since at least the 17th century, right? However, the language that changed is the language in England. So that's why there is such a difference between American English and US English. Right? In fact, American English is older than British English. Because once people move, they try to keep their own original dialects, right? Whereas on the mainland, British Isles, the language changed in their own way. Non-count noun, as count noun, this is normal that we see when we grade quizzes, when we grade essays. Although it's a hard work, I enjoy it. Although it's hard work, right? You can use a because you can use a in front of work when it's a piece of work, like work of art, like that, right? You can use a in that sense, but work in this example, work here is like labor. You cannot do that. Or Korean people are smart. They do conversion from a noun to a verb. Make a trip. So I tripped to the US last year. It doesn't exist in standard English. Trip as a verb. But American people changed the syntactic category of nouns every day though. Can you FedEx me that? Can you FedEx me that document? They could do that. So Korean English is no surprising that they do that also, right? Verb collocations. After dinner, they talk together. You guys find this right or not? In US English, it sounds strange. You don't need together, just they talk. So collocation, talk doesn't occur with together. They talk, just they talk. We help find her job. In standard English, you would say, we help her, right, to find, or we'll help her find a job like this. Please help him do his homework instead of please help do his homework, right? Help someone do something, right? That's standard English. Prepositions, this is just one example. The main topic of this lesson is about the coming of spring. You don't need about, right? The main topic of this lesson is the coming of spring, right? And in that textbook, so that has the same meaning as so plus adjective that, in which in fact they are so different, right? He started early so that he could catch the first train. So here, he started early so that, this is the purpose, right? Purpose clause. So that he could catch the first train, right? That's the purpose clause. It's different from the second one. He started so early that he could catch the first train, right? So this is like intensifier or something, intensifier. That is too early, like that. There's no purpose anymore here. And then the that here is the result, right? Purpose, in the first one, so that is a purpose. In the second one, so early that, that's the result. So very different. But in that textbook, it's the same, okay? And finally, for those of you who think that unless means if not, it doesn't, okay? Unless doesn't mean if not. Like, I'll be annoyed unless I arrive at 10. That's not good standard English. You have to say, I'll be annoyed if I don't arrive at 10 a.m., like that. Because unless doesn't mean if not. Unless means except if, right? So this is the standard English form. Except if, meaning that unless is an exception. Unless is an exception to the general, to what is true in general, right? So maybe some of you share these features, right? So which we call Korean English, right? So these are just part of what she found in that textbook. Now, if we have about 15 minutes left, so we'll study this is the last thing for our class. We are on Korean English, right? But but as we see, right, that he has a strong accent, right? From a perspective of native speaker, right? He has a strong accent, right? That's different from any major American dialects or British dialects, right? Now, what we'll do is I have transcribed his interview for you. So what we'll do is we'll analyze his Korean English, whether there are features that are non-native, for lack of a better term, whether there are features that are non-native, and whether you think his English is good or not. Okay, so we'll do that. So this is an extract from an interview with Ban Ki-moon, right, the current United Nations Secretary General, as you know, and he's Korean, and his term will be over by the end of this year, I think, or early next year. So he has been there for two terms already, right, since 2000 something, very early, 2005 or something, or 8. So the Secretary General is talking about a meeting of 4 political entities, and he called it the diplomatic quartet, right? Quart is 4, right? So consisting of the UN, United Nations, the US, the European Union, and Russia to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, right? And here you have two questions. So this is the question, very long, right? I often wonder how politicians or how people of this rank can answer questions, because once interviewers ask question is never short, right? So how many questions are there here, and how could we process, right, the information? But he can process the information, and he could come up with a very elegant answer here. So there are 2 questions, 2 big questions. So this is one, and this is another one. So we'll go through his speech here and identify things that are, for lack of a better term, that are non-native, right? We try to avoid saying that, but unless there's a better word for us. So we'll stick to non-native. Now, you can disregard the question. What do you think, maybe this one, what do you think about the role of Russia in the Middle East peace process? Okay, maybe that's the most important question, right? Because the last question is usually the most important one. I appreciate, first of all, this is Ban Ki-moon's answer. I appreciate, first of all, and highly commend the initiative and leadership of Russian government to host the quartet meeting at this time. So anything not familiar to you, anything that is obviously a non-native feature, anything in here that you notice? Or because you speak Korean English also, that's why you don't notice anything different? People who can say something like this are proficient, right? You look at the language that he used, like highly commends, right? That's not an everyday word that we would use in conversation, right? The initiative and leadership of Russian government to host the quartet meeting at this time. And he had things like, you know, I don't know, adverb or the sequence, right? Discourse marker sequence, like he's a proficient user of English, right? I appreciate, first of all, like that, and highly commend. But here, I'll use a different pen. But here, though, this is where it's non-native. You need the word the, right? Minor point, right? Very minor point, but this is where, of course, it doesn't affect intelligibility at all, right? Russian government is the Russian government, right? Whether there's the word the or no the, doesn't matter. But of course, it's a non-native speaker feature, right? And then he goes on, this is crucially important timing for the peace process in the Middle East. This is okay, right? The overall atmosphere has not been favorable. So this is good, right? The overall atmosphere has not been very favorable. Now, with the proximity talks now being facilitated by the United States, anything that you might notice here is very opportune timing for the principals of the quartet to express their support and encourage further. Anything that you notice as strikingly non-native here? You guys, are you speaking Korean English also? What should it be? Of course, we have ing and ing. I am being stupid, I'm being, and so on, right? But being facilitating by the United States, not good, right? What should it be? Being facilitated, right? Being facilitated by the United States. Maybe in this case, it doesn't really affect comprehension, right? Because you have by the United States, so you know who does what to whom, right? So facilitated, right? Facilitated. It's very opportune timing. This is a good phrase, right, to use. Very, very high register, very formal, right? So he's a proficient user of language. For the principals of the quartet to express their support and encourage further. This one is strange. You want to say encourage something, right? How should I explain this? You know transitive verbs or not? Transitive, verbs that need an object, right? Verbs that need an object to be expressed. Encourage is one such verb, okay? Encourage someone to do something like that. But here it's like intransitive, right? So you need encourage someone, or where's your object, right? And if you don't want to use it as a verb, you can say to express their support and encouragement. You can do that also. But if you want to use it as a verb, you need an object. Like express their support and encourage them further or something. And then if you read along, it's good. I'm quite convinced that this time the quartet leaders will be able to play a significant role, and very much encouraged by this, all perfect. At the same time, I would really hope that, here, Israeli government, again, you need the word, right? Should fully cooperate so that, this is a purpose clause, right? So that, in order that these proximity talks, here and here and here, maybe? This or these, right? He has to decide whether he wants to keep it a plural or a singular, and then use the verb accordingly, right? These proximity talks andeo, right? So these, plural, right? Which have been very difficult. How do you explain this? Do you think it's okay? Have been very difficultly arranged. Okay or not? Awkward. Because you don't use difficultly as an adverb, right? Have been arranged with difficulty, maybe. With difficulty. With difficulty. But not difficultly arranged. Maybe in Korean you do that. 어렵게 만들었어, like that. Difficultly, we rarely use it. We seldom use it as an adverb though, right? And facilitated by the United States and by the United Nations, right? And many other parties will not derail. Oh, cool, right? Because derail, metaphor, very highly proficient person. Derail, to become wrong, right? Derail is like for train to derail, to go out of track, right? To go out of the course, right? Because of settlement policies. I have strongly condemned this settlement policy which goes counter to the peace process mood. So everything else is perfect, right? So only these features. Do you think that these features affect comprehension, affect intelligibility or not? No, right? Not at all. Whether you have the or not the, and whether you have the object or not, encourage them further, or the no agreement of the determiner and the noun here. All these things do not, right, affect intelligibility. And in fact, he's a proficient user of English. Look at the words that he used: comment, opportune. Where's opportune? Opportune time, derail, right? Not many people would know all of these things, right? We are out of time, so we'll come back. Oh, it's a long time until I see you again. We'll come back on Wednesday to finish this off. So there are some non-native, in quotation marks, non-native features in here which you can identify. So see you on Wednesday. Please don't come on Monday because I'm not going to be here.